out west for an ordination with some of my classmates in Arizona. And as I was on my flight back to Chicago, I had scheduled a flight that was going to take off at 1 a.m. and return to Chicago at 6 a.m. Not the most ideal time to fly, you might all agree, but nonetheless, I would be able to get a few hours of sleep in. Now, I was getting comfortable in my airplane seat when an older gentleman came and sat next to me. We began a short conversation, but then the man kept talking and talking and talking. I thought, it's 1 a.m. I'm tired, everyone else on the plane is tired, but clearly this man is not tired. So I started dozing off, and I was quickly awakened by the sound of a moaning young child of about 3 years old who was in the next row. Those moans turned into cries, which then turned into shrieks. This was not the most pleasant plane ride. And to make it even better, by the time we were getting off the plane, there was a slight delay, and I ended up missing my bus that would take me back here by about 2 minutes. I'm not sharing this with you to get any sympathy points from you, but I want to point out that the whole thing going through my mind during this ordeal was, why does this have to happen to me? Why do I have to suffer through all of this? To have both of these things right next to me on the plane. In today's gospel, we see Jesus' apostles confessing him as the Christ, the long-waited-for Messiah. Now, I think that's a good start, right? It's good that they confess him as the Christ. That's a pretty good start level for them to be on. But they only got one side of the coin right. There's two sides of the coin when it comes to the Messiah. They expected Jesus to be the glorified and risen one as their mighty king. They wanted to see Jesus raised on high. But the problem is Jesus is not there to be glorified. He's not there to be raised on high or to be treated well. In fact, Jesus says the exact opposite in today's gospel. He says, the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected and ultimately be killed before he rises on the third day. Jesus is emphasizing the suffering nature of his mission. He shows that in order for him to be glorified and raised up, it's necessary that he suffer and be pushed down. In order to have the resurrection, he must first go through the cross. As I was reading this gospel, I realized that during my plane ride, I responded the same way that the apostles did. The apostles did not want to hear that Jesus was going to suffer. They wanted nothing to do with the suffering. They thought he was going to be this glorious king, and that they wouldn't have to suffer either. At the same time, I did not want to suffer the discomforts of that plane ride, of having all this noise and sleep deprivation going on when I was tired. I wanted that plane ride to go exactly the way that I had planned. I wanted the resurrection without the cross. Jesus says, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must first deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. This brings us to a very old question that humanity has struggled with, especially in the last century. The question is of evil and suffering. Why does God allow so much evil and suffering in the world? Now, my suffering was very minuscule on that airplane when you compare it to the suffering of many people on this earth, especially in recent times. Why are there so many natural disasters? Why do so many people die of natural illness? Why do people do evil things? Like many of the mass killings that we've had recently, we may ask ourselves, why does God allow this? In Jesus' case, we have to ask ourselves, why did God the Father allow Jesus himself to suffer and die? Once again, in order to have the resurrection, we must first go through the cross. I'm not saying that God intends all the evil and suffering in the world. He has given us free will to make decisions. If we want to commit evil, we have the free will. But in the midst of all the suffering that happens in the world, the Lord brings good out of it. Whether it's as great as a national tragedy like we had last week in Orlando, or as minuscule as a crying child next to you, God brings about a greater good. God brought about patience in me on that airplane. God brought about the resurrection of Christ and the redemption of humanity after the crucifixion on the cross. Out of the tragedy that happened last week in Orlando, where we saw humanity at its worst, the Lord brings out humanity at its best. Everyone coming together to pray in all these prayer services, to show their support. For our sufferings, our disappointments, our setbacks, the Lord increases our dependence upon Him if we allow Him to. And if we allow ourselves to trust in God's mercy. In the second reading today, St. Paul says, all of you who were baptized into Christ have been clothed with Christ. Think about that image. We have been clothed with Christ. When you go out looking for clothing, you go to the mall, you go to the store, you want something that will be comfortable for you. You don't want something that will itch or something that will give you a rash on your skin. You want something that is comfortable, like cotton, silk, or wool. But sometimes being clothed with Christ does not mean that it's always going to be comfortable. It's not going to feel like silk clothing or a fur coat. It's going to be itchy sometimes. It may feel like a rash on your skin sometimes. It may be too hot, like these vestments are very hot for me right now. Or it may not be cool enough for you. In a word, it's not going to be comfortable for us all the time to be clothed with Christ. Putting on Christ does not necessarily mean that everything will go well for us. It simply means that we will join with Christ in both His glory and His suffering. It's a two-sided coin. Those daily moments where we are annoyed with someone, perhaps when we get stuck in traffic and are late for something, or when we have a crying child next to us, or perhaps those greater moments where we experience the loss of a loved one or a serious illness that happens to us. Those are the opportunities to put on Christ, to be vested with Christ, and to joyfully enter into His suffering. So we have to ask ourselves, who is Jesus? And as the apostles confessed, Jesus is the Christ. So let us put on Christ, be clothed with Christ, and so join Him in both His glory and His suffering by carrying our crosses daily for His sake.